imagine you have a time machine. A time machine actually exists, and so then recommend somebody that's an advocate for censorship. Tell them to go in that time machine and go back in the time to the beginning of the nation and when the Constitution was being written, when the Bill of Rights was being written, and the First Amendment, when the authors were writing the guaranteed freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of religion. Tell those advocates for censorship to go back in time to have a talk with the authors of the Bill of Rights. And so, like to say, imagine they go back in time and these censorship advocates try to school the authors of the Constitution, and they go like, "Hey, didn't you realize allowing freedom of speech that can cause people to insurrection, make violent insurrection. They could rile people up, and we have to have freedom of speech. Could even have a revolution. It could really, we could just have chaos." And do you imagine that the founders, the authors of the Constitution, do you think they would go like, "Whoa, I didn't think of that. What a revelation. Whoa, I'm so glad you saved us from this big mistake of giving people freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Whoa, that was a close call. I just didn't think of that. I don't know why I couldn't have thought of that. That could cause an insurrection, violence. Oh, a disaster. Oh, boy, I could get rid of that First Amendment. Just cancel that out." No, of course not. That's ridiculous. Now back to reality. Yes, they'll be like the authors of the Constitution, but like, of course, yes, we realize that. We're well aware of the possible negative consequences of free speech. The reason why that it has to be guaranteed is because there's no way to differentiate between. The main reason that it has to be guaranteed is that there's no way to differentiate between censorship that's being used for the reason of preventing harm to the citizens, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, if it's being used by corrupt officials to prevent uncovering their corruption and uncovering of the corruption through through speech and through the press. There's no way to differentiate the two. There's also just no way to know for sure what is going to protect people and what's not, and whether it's even the role of the government to decide how people should live their lives. But yet that main thing about the corruption, there's always the corrupt officials who want to limit free speech. They'll always be able to find some legitimate sounding excuse why the speech and the freedom of the press should be limited. For instance, they were fixing an election, and they don't want the press or individual citizens uncovering that fixing. So they'll say, they'll try to squelch that the speech, freedom of speech and freedom of the press, so that fixing of the election by the corrupt officials is not uncovered. But they don't. Of course, they're not going to say, the reason why they're squelching speech and the press is because they don't want to be covered as corrupt officials. Of course not. They're not going to come right out and say that. They'll come up with some excuse why speech and the press needs to be quelled. And they could say, we don't want to. If people, they'll try to make it sound like it's obvious that it was a free and fair election, and they'll say, if people start questioning it, then that could eventually lead to some sort of violent insurrection, where they could even say storm the nation's capital. And so they'll say, we have to prevent that. So we have to, in order to prevent such an insurrection, we have to silence those that are questioning an election results. So that's the justification that they give. But of course, there's no way to tell what is on its face. There's no way to tell what's the real reason why people's speech and the press, their freedom is being squelched and denied. There's no way to tell on its face what is the legitimate reason. Is it to prevent an insurrection, or is it to prevent an uncovering of a genuine fixing of an election? So that's why that's the main reason why freedom of speech and freedom of the press needs to be guaranteed, in order to, along with just allowing people to decide, citizens to decide for themselves what is the best way to govern, what is the best way to live their lives, and it should be left up to the citizens rather than the government officials, as though, given that there's epistemologically there's no way to tell who's the best person to decide how we should govern society. So yeah, they're not going to go, oh, why didn't I think of that? This is not a revelation that negative consequences can happen from freedom of speech. But these people, advocates for censorship, they're pretending like it is some kind of revelation. Like, oh, hey, you know what? This could have bad consequences if people start being allowed to say what they think. And it's as though, oh wow, this is really new. Why didn't the founders think of this? Or they may also pretend as though they can do both freedom of speech while also protecting society by censoring some speech. So they're saying, well, we'll censor some speech, but only that speech that has these negative consequences. But otherwise, we'll allow freedom of speech. But I'm arguing that you can't do both. You can't juggle both. You can't get a little bit pregnant when it comes to censorship, because as I already argued, there's no way to differentiate between what is censorship done for benevolent intent and what is being done for corrupt reasons, to keep corruption covered up. There's no way to tell on its face what the reason is for squelching speech and squelching the press. And along with there's no way to know for sure what constitutes. Oftentimes it's hard to even tell what is harm and what is good. These normative questions that are judgment calls that we all should be able to decide for ourselves how to govern and how to live our lives. So that's why you can't just do just a little bit of censorship for one, just to protect the people. We're going to protect the people for a little bit of censorship there, but otherwise we're going to allow freedom of speech. No, you can't. Yeah, that's why the amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. They're done not in arbitrary order. The First Amendment is done because it's with the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and freedom of religion. It's because they were the top priorities. It was emphasized unequivocally. Those are to be guaranteed. No asterisks is saying, well, except in these cases. No, they're guaranteed without exception. And it is for good reason why that's done. They're well aware, the founders, of the dangers, of potential dangers of allowing such freedoms, but they had the courage to do them anyways, because they understood what the priorities were of a nation that is supposed to be centered on the rights of the individual in that citizen, in the country. They were well aware of the dangers of corruption amongst officials and the dangers of the hubris and megalomania that can easily develop when people are given power, and there needs to be measures against that kind of megalomania that almost inevitably develops when power is given to officials in politics. So, bringing up these rules about misinformation, that is then, if you're going to limit, restrict speech because it is supposedly misinformation, that is censorship. That is restricting the freedom of the citizen. That's what the founders, the Bill of Rights, was supposed to prevent, that kind of censorship, that kind of that is a restriction on our freedoms. Yes, it could cause misinformation. Maybe it is. Maybe it could cause bad consequences. But then that will be done by the citizens. This is something that we need to either we believe in democracy and the people and the general citizenry, whether we believe they are basically good or not. We will live or die by the decisions of the public and the judgment calls that they make. Myself, I believe that is the good way to govern, because I have more faith and confidence in the general citizenry than I do those that have political power, due to the inherent corrupting power of power itself. So we need to realize that misinformation, so-called misinformation, needs to be allowed, and have the courage to allow that misinformation, even given all these scary potential negative consequences. Because I believe that the scarier scenario is if we're going to allow for censorship and give those that are in power and all the inherent corrupting power of power itself that ability to limit our freedoms and in turn feed the megalomania of those that already are in power. This is like a sort of a political power is sort of like I like to call survival of the evilest. There's a way to, the scum tends to rise to the top, and so then but the plebs tend to be basically good. So what we're doing when we allow censorship, we're giving more power to the corrupted, and allow more corruption in turn. It actually encourages corruption because it allows for cover-ups of corruption. But where those that are in power, they'll just use some other excuse for why they are restricting our censorship. They're saying it's for our own good. They're saying Big Brother knows best, and that's why we're limiting your speech. That's why we've declared that to be misinformation. Those statements that, but in reality, are uncovering the corruption of those in power. So it's very important that, yeah, you can't get a little bit pregnant when it comes to censorship. Either you're limiting the freedoms of speech, or you're allowing for freedom of speech. It's either or. You can't have it both ways. Then that also includes, this matters of science and medicine, whether it's climate science or medical science. it's either way, it's all a matter of judgment calls, and there's no way to tell. And there's no way to tell who's providing the true answer in terms of what is like, say, medically, what's the cause and effect. When we're talking about science in a practical sense of either climate or medicine, we rely on a very complex causal chains of events, such that we can call either the climate or the human body are complex systems, where it's always going to be a judgment call. What actions that we're taking have such and such consequence down the line. So that's why there's often, like with say in general popular health issues, we'll say something is healthy or maybe it's not healthy, and they go back and forth because we really don't know for certain. We're never going to have certainty when it comes to what's such and such is good for us or bad for us, because of the inherent uncertainty in medicine. We know they talk about like etiology, which is basically what is the cause of any given disease or illness. Well, why don't they just say cause? What's the cause of the disease? Well, when they're talking to the public, they'll say cause, such cause, this or that. But within their field of medicine, they'll talk about etiology, and they use that word because it's the study of the causal chain of events that leads to any different illness. And the reason they use such a word is because saying the cause and effect is just too simple. It's always etiology that is always both complex and uncertain. There's always uncertainty in medicine, and there's also always uncertainty in climate. Because, well, for one thing, the causation as a thing in itself is never an empirically verifiable phenomena. You just have different events that may not be reliably happen one after the other, but causation as a thing in itself is never an empirically verifiable phenomena. And now when you talk about, maybe you say, realistically, sure, one thing causes another in a Newtonian sense, maybe. But even in a common sense, realistic standpoint, you cannot even say that when it comes to complex systems, such as the human body or the climate over a long period of time. That's always going to be uncertain about what causes what, because there's so many different relationships between these atoms and molecules over time. There's no way to know with any very high degree of certainty what causes what. I mean, you can say, I'll just give one example. In medicine, not that long ago, there was something called, there's something called ptomaine poisoning, and for the longest, that's a type of food poisoning, and for the longest time, the prevailing opinion of the scientists medical scientists was that ptomaines were frequently the cause of food poisoning. So you have that term ptomaine poisoning, and because they thought that the ptomaines were the cause of were causing the food poisoning illnesses. But that was not that many decades ago that the medical scientists thought that. Now they've there's been a paradigm shift. Scientists recognize that ptomaines, yes, they do exist. They're a product of the rotting of foods, they do recognize, yes, there are such a thing as ptomaines, but they've come to the conclusion that ptomaines are harmless, completely innocuous substances. Oh, but of course, imagine going back to the time when the prevailing consensus was that ptomaines did cause food poisoning. So imagine, what if there's a scientist that goes out or stands up, like just one or two scientists would say, well, I don't know, I don't think ptomaines are harmful. I think they're innocuous. I think they're harmless substances. How do you think those scientists would be treated? I think they would be ridiculed. They would be called quacks. Ostracized by the scientific community. So that now look, okay, now let's, but and then of course later on they would be found, oh hey, they were right all along. Now let's go back to something like today in medicine, and there we talk about certain treatments, say a vaccine for a disease, and you may say, what about, now there are a lot of doctors that have questioned a certain vaccine. A lot of scientists, quite a few do, although they may be in a minority, probably because there's so many, the ones that do question this vaccine, they're often sanctioned by their old medical bodies, and they're criticized. They're just really have to face a lot of ridicule and criticism for their position. That when they think that if they claim that it does more harm than good. So how are we to tell whether they're like say a scientist that questioned the danger of ptomaines before that they actually thought they're harmless? Suppose back when the consensus among the scientific community was that ptomaines are causing food poisoning. Now let's go back. Oh, now we have things flipped around. Look. The consensus is that these vaccines in question are relatively harmless and helpful is the consensus. And now there's a few that are saying, oh no, I think they're do more harm than good. Who's right? I mean, there's no way to tell on its face who's the ones providing the misinformation. Back there's a while when the misinformation was that ptomaines were causing food poisoning, and that was the consensus of the scientific community. How do we know who's the visionary that's right all along, even though they're in the minority? It's not a democracy in terms of epistemologically. That is, we don't know who is correct based on what the consensus is among the scientific community. There's no way to know on its face. There's no way using just basic logic or empirical findings who's right. It's a wash. So just let people decide for themselves instead of saying, oh, that's anybody that disagrees with the majority view in the scientific community, anybody that disagrees with that majority view is providing misinformation and therefore needs their speech to be squelched and silenced. And the problem there, of course, you don't know if they're the ones that are right all along. They could be the visionary that sees things as correct, that are getting persecuted for just because they're questioning the dominant scientific paradigm that has the most political power within the scientific community. But there's no way of knowing one way or the other with any certainty. So let them speak. The contrarians, the let the prevailing, let them speak to the prevailing majority of the scientific community. Let them speak, and let the contrarian minority, let them speak as well, and let the people decide what is misinformation and what is not. Another thing was like germ theory. That at one point that was the people advocates for germ theory were they were the contrarian minority, and the prevailing majority of the scientific community would be criticizing that as misinformation. They would have called germ theory misinformation, and a lot of today's political figures would have tried hard to censor anybody that was trying to push that germ theory forward. They would try to censor it, which is rather ironic given the current atmosphere surrounding certain contagious diseases. So, there's no way to tell. Who has the true and accurate premise, and who is providing the false information, the misinformation. You need to. That's just another reason why we need to have full and free and open speech, rather than this idea that people in power need to be allowed to be the ones to decide what is true and what is false. Or just assume that those that are in the majority opinion in the scientific community, assuming they are the ones that are true, and anybody that in that community that questions that prevailing opinion is false. And we have shown how in his history of science that has not always been the case at all. So we need to let both sides have their say, and give the citizens some credit for being able to decide for themselves who is providing the correct premise, and not censor anybody's viewpoint. We just allow for all viewpoints to have their say, and then let the individual citizen decide for themselves what is true and what is false. That's my viewpoint. I think I've said enough for now, and I hope I've provided some good ideas. And if you're still watching, thanks for watching.